Top of the day to you boys and girls. We're at the bench in the shop for another little narrative session. Throwing the disclaimers out right in the beginning. This is going to be a narrative. We're going to be looking at a whole lot of one particular saw. This may be tedious and boring if you're not a knuckle/gearhead like myself. At that point, if you are, it may be interesting, informative, and possibly even enjoyable. The other part of the disclaimer, I have a tendency to slammer my speech. That's a quote-unquote word I made up to cover the stammer and slur my speech concept. Please forgive me if I do in this process. Also check the description for any clarifications and or qualifications and additions. In case I find something that needs to be addressed, my contact information's in a lot of the description area of a lot of the videos I have as well. Please disregard the Cherry 066 down on the bench. That's already spoken for. But anyway, on track, today we're going to be looking at what I think is the latest entry from the Echo line. We have us a cs-2511T. It's a little mini baby saw. I think it's 2.3 kilograms, which that means it tips the scales at about, I think it's 5.07 as far as pounds of weight, which is pretty much weightless. We'll be looking at some of the reasons why that is as this process unfolds. I guess claim to fame, smallest and lightest production saw that's currently made, at least that I know of anyway. It's a 25 cc saw with a 35 millimeter bore and a 26 millimeter stroke, so it's way over square in the engine design. One of the reasons why it struggled quite a bit with the 16-inch bar that we put on this thing with the still Pico super chain is it's not a grunt saw in the engine design, it's a high winder saw. But that's kind of an interesting side note. There's so much to cover, I don't even know where to begin. We usually try to do these with a comparison, but there's so much going on with this saw. It's going to take a while to get it all out. So if we look at the nuts and bolts, just I guess to get the process started, you can see there's a lot. You have to dismantle the entire saw to get the crankcase and cylinder assembly out before you can even take the cylinder off. It's impressive. Completely dismantle the entire saw. So if we do the normal situation, we'll look at the handlebar setup for a second, I guess. We have this is technically a top handle saw, but it also has the half wrap version going on with this particular saw. Oh, and a 1-year commercial warranty too. They stand behind their products very well. Husky and Skilled, they don't do it quite like that. But anyway, kind of like the 200T 335 from Husqvarna, but more so the way it's designed with the carburetor in the back. It's really kind of a mini version 200T in a lot of respects. One of the things I did notice, you only have one linkage for the trigger. The shaft goes back through. We'll look at how the choke is actuated in a second. Extremely lightweight, obviously. This weighs pretty much nothing. It's all plastic. As a side note, you don't want to drop this saw from any kind of distance because it's completely plastic down to the whole case system. Now we have noticed there's a piece of foam with some reflective tape on the back side of the gas tank. Crankcase fits in right here essentially. So they're trying to keep some of the heat off that area. Fits in like that essentially. You have to pull it, like I said, the crankcase out to get the piston and cylinder disassembled from the crankcase. The oiler's pretty open. They have a little cover that fits over this area right here. that pops in behind the bar plate. They actually have a pretty interesting little chain catcher. It's a roller style. Thought that was really cool. But they're completely plastic, so the motor is a unit, the engine technically, and it's bolted in 3 places is where the actual crankcase cylinder assembly is secured back here and here and here. But again, super lightweight. If we look at the spark plug comes out here, it has a little cover that pops on, held by a little bracket here. Metal spring system. Kind of cool in that respect. If we look at the air cleaner cover, it sits on the back of the pistol grip. Top handle assembly, it's held on with a little plastic latch system. So again, we're dealing with super lightweight in this whole concept. If we segue over to the pull starter or recoil assembly, we see it's kind of got a Husky-esque pulley on it. But one of the really cool things that I noticed is you can take the handle from the pull starter cover and you can actually use it to get the oil or gas cap loose if you happen to cinch them down too tight. I thought that was pretty ingenious, but we're talking super lightweight. I'm probably going to use interesting way more times than I should in this process because there's all kinds of interesting. We have the clutch cover with the chain brake assembly, kind of like some of the 5 Series Huskies are doing. You can see the brake band. It's pretty contained with the dust flap. We're trying to keep a lot of that material from getting on the muffler, which sits right here essentially. This would be the cover. It is bolted in. Sits right here essentially. So we're trying to keep all the debris from getting on the muffler. Obviously we're trying not to start a fire. One of the cool things about this, we have a captive nut situation going on here. Really lightweight design though. It's just got a piece of wire that goes around a recess that's cast into the nut. So the engineers were definitely spending a lot of time thinking about this process. If we go back to the top handle for a second, it's held on by 4 springs. So this is a spring-mounted saw. We have actually 2 are on the opposite side up in the front. The 2 bigger ones are larger diameter. And we have this one goes on the drive side. This is on the flywheel side. So it's a spring-mounted system. So it is pretty smooth actually. If we look underneath, we'll talk about the coil. It's a 2-pole system. We actually have a couple of spacers that fit on the side of the cylinder. The coil rests on those. I'm assuming we're trying to keep some of the heat from getting into the coil. That was my assumption. I have no idea at this point why. That makes kind of sense. It's insulated in a way, but the bolt's going to be grounding it. Just kind of an interesting way of looking at it. If we get underneath the air cleaner cover, we see it's got a Husky kind of style air cleaner where you use a screwdriver to pop it in half. It's flocked. It actually has a lot of surface area for such a little saw. That was kind of cool. This flange system, locking flange system, is bolted to the back side of the carburetor. It's essentially a 1/10 of a twist actuation system. You put it on and twist the air cleaner. That's why this little metal bracket is here. It's also acting as a sealing ring. It goes inside. I've noticed just a little bit that I ran it. Guy might end up having to grease that if you're working in some super fine particulates. It does have a raised groove around it where it mates up with the back of the carburetor, which is going to help add the a sealing effect to it. Just some things that I was noticing. If we look at the carburetor itself, like I mentioned, we have only one linkage that comes through the T-handle. The on-off for the choke is actuated by this lever that sticks out right in this place here. Essentially, again, we're dealing with super lightweight. We have what I think is an 11 millimeter Venturi, so it's not that small. This has stops, so it has needles, which is really cool. If we look a little further underneath, we see the manifold itself. It's got a ring in it to keep the rubber from deforming, I imagine. That's similar in Husky and Still. We did find this little piece of plastic that goes in this little hole right here in the end of my thumbnail. I'm also assuming we're trying to keep deformity from happening. I'm not really sure. You have to be super careful when you're dismantling this saw. It has more nuts and bolts, well, mostly more bolts than I've seen getting the cylinder off of any saw. If we look in the manifold itself, we see it has the raised ridges in there. We've talked about those being in Still models. Some Huskies have a variation of that. They might use a little metal insert that has holes drilled in it, but you can see those, they're just little diamond shape or little pyramid shape raised part of the molding in the manifold itself, but it goes all the way through. If we look here, we can see it's kind of like some of the Huskies had insulator block years ago on a lot of 2 series saws. You can see a little raised piece of rubber on this side of the intake manifold, which mates up to the back of the cylinder, but you can see we go from completely round to completely rectangular, but it's actually got a fairly long manifold for being such a small saw. But I was kind of impressed with the fact that they're using ridges in there for such a great distance to try to really atomize the fuel. If we look at the cylinder, we see it comes in at a really steep angle on the intake, which the steeper the angle, the less direction change, the better for performance. This is where the manifold mates up. You can see the pulse circuit going through right here. Kind of cool. Little teeny tiny cylinder. It's got a hemispherical spark plug application designed into this saw, so it's got a Hemi. Thought that was pretty cool. I mean, it comes straight out the back. Interesting. We're dealing with a quad loop system here, but they're not consistent from one side to the other. Oh, we forgot to talk about the shape. So it's really rectangular to kind of a little more oval in a relatively short distance. So it went from round to rectangular to oval, so they're necking it down a little bit more slow, if you will. Back on track though, we're looking at the quad loop system, which a lot of people thought that Husky invented that, but it's been around since in the 40s, I think. There's even some saws have actually 6 ports in there, although the back 2 will generally be dead. Just as a side note, if we look at them though, they're not the same shape. They're not located in the same concept design-wise, but they're different shape size-wise. They're different locations in the cylinder. I thought that was kind of cool. This is a little piece of aluminum that they actually wedged in there at some point, so they didn't have to do such a fine casting job, because this front leading edge of this side of the loop is really, really small, so they just stuffed a piece of aluminum in there. It is bridged in the casting itself right at the down in the cylinder, but it's kind of a simplistic way of doing it, especially since it's so small. Again, we talked about a 35mm bore. The exhaust port is fairly wide for such a small bore. It's got a little divot in there. I don't know if you can see it. We're going to get the start of the exhaust to kind of be they're trying to get an effect essentially when they do something other than what you see in a normal application of the exhaust port, whether it's swirling, the evacuation process. They're trying to accomplish something in particular. They'll never let me talk to the engineers. I don't speak their language anyway. But anyway, conceptually, we're going to start the flow right there in that little divot below my finger. The exhaust isn't exactly perpendicular center line with the stroke. It's actually offset a little bit, so you don't have such a extreme 90-degree angle as the exhaust evacuates. This is essentially the exhaust port. So, well, this is like right where it mates up with the muffler essentially. so it's the end of the exhaust port technically. But anyway, so it's offset a little bit, so the exhaust doesn't have to make such a sharp transition. It's not completely 90. It's nice and smooth. I don't know if you can see that in there or not. It's real smooth the way it comes out of the exhaust and slopes around. Fairly good size. One thing we forgot to mention, we being me, you can see in the cylinder it's not the same from one side to the other. Again, they're trying to accomplish something in this process. I'm not sure exactly what it is at this point. I have a hypothesis, but it's just my thoughts. It's similar to what we see in the Dolmars right on this. I think this is technically the flywheel side. The back loop is bigger in the on this side. It's essentially similar to what we see in some of the Dolmar saws, the 7900 essentially. If we look at this one, it's more like what you see in the quad loop system for the Husqvarnas. Interesting. I find that to be, they got carte blanche when they designed this particular saw, obviously, and they did some tricky things. If we look at the piston, we see it's a complete motorcycle style, even including the dead ports. Really small. It's got an 8mm wrist pin. Pressurizing the crankcase. It's kind of a dome-shaped piston as well. It's actually really rough on the top, though. That could be for a specific reason. I'm not really sure. If we look at the base gasket, it's kind of steel-esque in a way. It's metal surrounded with what seems to be like a rubber coating, so it's real similar to the steel, what we see in a lot of the steel saws. If we look at the crankcase, it's a little teeny tiny thing. It's actually cute. It's got a pretty wide bearing on the journal of the crank, but you can see the charging of the cylinder itself is kind of interesting the way they've designed the cases. They're not a carbon copy as what we see with the Husqvarnas. It's kind of Husqvarna looking in a way. If we think about what's happening, they're trying to direct the flow for some specific reason. What that reason is, like I said, I don't know. You can see how it comes up and it's allowed to flow around and get in the start of the transfer port circuit. One thing I noticed about the bearing system on the piston pin or wrist pin, it has a couple of little caps. I guess they're holding it in place in the end of the rod. You can see the rod is pretty small at the top. They're trying to keep the weight down since this saw is a little teeny tiny thing. There are reliefs though to let some oil get in there to lubricate the bearing on the piston pin area, and also in the bottom where the journal is, there's a little relief right there. So it's kind of interesting. It's got pretty good sized bearings for such a small little saw. I was impressed. Actually, it's got pretty good sized bearings in it, so you shouldn't really have a problem with the bottom end. Single ring design, but we kind of already looked at that. If we look at the muffler now for a second, it's stainless, it's relatively heavy. It doesn't have much of a transition to where it has to go down into the cavity. I'm wondering if they kind of copied anything from the Dolmar line where they have that bleed down tube in there. I don't know if you can see the opening for the exhaust. It's kind of small, but at 25 cc's, what's a guy expect, I guess. If we look at the clutch, it's little teeny tiny, but it's 3-spring design, which is pretty standard. We have a spacer that sits underneath the clutch, in between the clutch itself, the assembly of the clutch and the drum, spacing issue, and then we have a spacer that sits in between the oiler gear, which is really cool. And the crankcase, this is a spacer that fits underneath of it. What I found to be interesting, oh yeah, and here's the bearing for the clutch. Everything's a little teeny tiny, as I already mentioned, but we have two little tangs that stick up on the oiler gear. They fit in at the bottom of the spur sprocket in the little, basically the bottom of the drive area for the, this is where your chain is working, obviously, so the drivers fit into this location as it spins. That's what causes the chain to go around, obviously, but anyway, they're using these little tangs that fit right in there, so super lightweight, ingenious concept, the way they mated that up. I was actually kind of impressed. If we look at the flywheel for a second, kind of a husky situation where we have the pawls are actuated by a spring, similar to what we see on some 5 series saws. I think the 372 has something pretty similar to this as well. It's got a pretty good weight to it though for such a little tiny saw. So even though we have an over square engine design, we have a pretty good amount of weight in the flywheel because it's metal. I thought that was kind of cool. It'll help a little bit with the low end grunt. We didn't really look at the spacer. It's got a nice cooling plate, really thick actually, aluminum cooling plate in between the muffler and the cylinder. This is heavy, so it's going to do good with the cooling. We have normally a screen that we see for spark arresting purposes. So I think we kind of covered the gamut with this little saw. We're going to get it whipped into shape. The owner decided we're going to Insano-wise this saw, so I'm going to be putting the hurt on it here shortly. I'm really curious to see how it does once it's Insano-wise with that 16-inch bar. I haven't touched that chain, nor will I until we mate it up with this saw again. So anyway, kind of a long-winded session, I guess. Kind of a lot of points of interest through this process. A lot of tricky design went into this. We have a lot of nuts and bolts to get the cylinder assembly taken care of and out of the saw, but kind of a cool little machine. So anyway, thanks for watching this session. Hopefully you found it interesting and informative. I also hope that wherever you might be on God's green earth, that you are having a blessed day. Thanks for watching.